Okay, so welcome to our webinar with Chris Jones. Chris is going to be talking tonight about the Chicago art and entertainment scene, the road to recovery. Chris has been at our library on a few occasions, and it's always such a pleasure to have him. For those of you that don't know him yet, he is the chief theater critic and culture columnist for the Chicago Tribune. He's been keeping us updated for the last 11 months about everything about how the pandemic has impacted Chicago's entertainment scene. And I know I've really been following them closely. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here on Zoom.
So I'm going to turn off my camera and my microphone, but I will be available for chat for anyone that needs help or assistance or has questions. And when Chris is done, we will go to Q&A.
All right. Very good. Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here talking with you today. I hope everybody is keeping safe and keeping well, and if appropriate, signing up for the vaccine and getting ready for our big return to normalcy, which I'm predicting will be here by the fall, I think. And hopefully even as soon as this summer, we'll be able to come together, at least in some form, I think, for live arts and entertainment. What I thought I would do today a little bit is just sort of take you through my year, I suppose. Here I am, this theater critic who spent, I have been one for longer than I like to remember, and I would go every night to the theater traditionally. And then that's not what I've been doing since March, and I'm coming at you from my basement, where I now spend a lot of quality time. So I thought I would sort of take you through a little bit of that and what some of the issues that I've dealt with have been, and also along the way, sort of talk about, what's been going on in the arts and entertainment world here, since I talk to those people so much. So that's my plan for a half an hour or so. So I hope you will stay with me and listen to me, and hopefully I'll say some things of interest to you. So for me, this story kind of began on March the 11th, 2020, which is a little less than 11 months ago as we sit here right now. I was at the Brooks Atkinson Theater on Broadway watching a show called Six, which is about the six wives of Henry VIII. It's a show I'd actually already seen at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, but it was opening on Broadway the following night, so I'd gone to New York to review it on Broadway, as had been my custom. And that night was very strange. There'd been all this talk of a new virus growing in intensity, especially in New York City. I've been in New York the previous week as well. And I was this week. I even had to get sort of special permission from my bosses to travel because the corporation wasn't allowing anybody to travel. So, but they agreed. I said, look, there's a Broadway opening, there's a critic, the critic has to be there. And so I gone. And I sat there that night with a friend, huddled in my seat on Broadway. I'm going to let the dog into the room because she's scratching the door. Come on. There you go. And I was sitting there in my seat, and it felt to me a bit like we were all fiddling while Rome burned. There, it was an ordinary opening night. Every seat was taken. Everybody was uneasily sort of doing what people do on opening nights, on press nights on Broadway. And it was a strange evening. And I actually left before the bows, which I never really do, but I had already seen the encore in Chicago. And I said to my friend, I just want to get out of here. And we got out of here. And we went to our favorite watering hole in Midtown. It's a bar restaurant called Un Deux Trois, sadly now closed. And there we sat, and another friend of ours joined us who was an actor. And he was in a show downtown, and he was talking about a dresser who had a very bad cough and how they were all worried about this dresser. And we said to him, we don't think you're going back tomorrow night. And we all sort of sat there, and it felt a bit like, the first scene of, I guess, right before intermission in Cabaret, where everyone's dancing like it's the last night of the world. And that was sort of the vibe that we had with the waiters and the restaurants. I'd hugged the maitre d' because I'm a big hugger, and he's a big hugger. And so that was where it was. And we thought, the theater could close down here. You might not be going back until the summer. And then we said in a really sort of apocalyptic tone, it could be that none of this is going to come back until the fall. Obviously, we had no idea of just how long it was all going to be. But I think I was aware that something was changed suddenly. The previous week, I'd gone to New York to review a show on Broadway called The Girl from the North Country. And what it was a Bob Dylan jukebox review, if you can believe that. But it was a show set to the music of Bob Dylan. And there was a moment in the show where the audience, like people in musicals often do, turned out to, where the actors, turned out to the audience. It was a song that they were including the audience in, and they all moved to the front of the stage, and we all watched them. And I'm sitting, 10 or 12 rows back in one of those good critic seats. And I see somebody in the front row wearing a mask, one person in a theater full of, I don't know, 1,500 people, certainly 1,000 people. And I remember thinking, I guess I watched the actors and I watched them recoil from this person. And it wasn't because they were opposed to mask wearing, obviously. It was because nobody was doing it. This was March the 4th. There was one person in a mask. And it sort of changed the vibe of the whole theater at that moment. It was like the usual sort of reciprocated love between performer and audience seemed, to be undermined by it somehow. That everyone was sort of spiraling off into 100 different questions. Did this person have the virus? Should we all have stayed home? How will we all survive? What might be about to happen to us? Or was this all some overwrought media-induced panic about what was in essence a version of the flu we thought back then? And God knows we could hear that argument being made from the White House and other places. But nonetheless, it was unusual enough. Just sort of take this in with me for a second. It was unusual enough for your friend Chris Jones here to write a story in the Chicago Tribune on March the 4th, 2020, on how strange it was to encounter one person wearing a mask at a theater. That's where we were on March the 4th, 2020. So it's worth noting, I think, right now, just how far we've come and how much the world has changed in that 11 months. It's kind of extraordinary to me. And it has been an enormous sea change. I think it's really important to understand that prior to the pandemic, the world of arts and entertainment had really doubled down on what I would call interactive engagement. What I mean by that is that the people who make their money from live entertainment have basically, I guess, discerned or theorized that the pervasive use of technology was leading people to feel more isolated. So the assumption was that if people were sort of sick of being isolated by their technology, little did they know, but at that point, then what they would really buy at the theater or at a museum or at a concert was very, very interactive, immersive live entertainment. And so that meant more meet and greets with actors, more rappers crowd surfing. I even saw Donny Osmond crowd surf not that long before the pandemic. People were relaxing rules about food and drink in the theater and the concert hall. There were more and more chances to reach out and touch performers, the surfaces of works of art, things like that. Many of the physical divides that the theater had traditionally allowed for, say, actors on the stage, audience in the seats, that was actually being undermined or being reduced. It was quite common by 2008, 2009 on Broadway to see people on the stage. They actually seated people on the stage in many, many shows on Broadway. So what we were seeing right up until the pandemic was an increase in sort of interactivity. The other strange thing was that Broadway had weathered all kinds of crises before. So, but this one, for reasons I'm about to explain, really created a whole set of different challenges that proved probably harder for the theater than any other crisis. Like I grew up with my mom, who's still with us, touch wood, and doing okay at 97. She, told me stories when I was younger of the Second World War in her hometown of Manchester, where their theaters were open, the dance halls were open, the bombs were falling outside, but everyone still went out to live entertainment because it was sort of an act of defiance. It was saying essentially, we're not going to change our lives just because you're trying to bomb us. It was a patriotic act to go to the theater. And in many ways, the same thing applied right after September the 11th. If you remember back then, the theaters in New York reopened on September the 13th, which was the Thursday night, which, when you think about it, was an incredible feat. Incredible, given how complex shows like The Producers or The Lion King were. They somehow, thanks to Rudy Giuliani and the different Rudy that was then, they got everybody to the theaters, mostly because Giuliani insisted on it. He said, I want to show people New Yorkers are not cowed by this terrible attack. We want to carry on. We want to show that we're open for business. And he said to people on TV, if you want to help New York, go to a show. So even then, even though that night the theaters were not full, it was still sort of a proud act to go to the theater. Yes, there was personal risk involved, and there really was that week. People didn't know if there were bombs in Times Square or anything like that. People still went because they felt it was something they could do to show pride and support for the country and for its way of life. It was very, very important to a lot of people to actually go. I'd also point out, you might have sort of forgotten this, or maybe your parents told you this, or your grandparents, but back in the previous flu epidemic of 1918 or so, it was quite common to go to the theater too. For a story I did somewhere this summer, I actually looked at the advertisements for theaters in that era. And the Uptown Theater, for example, was not only open, but it was actually touting its air as being superior to outside. So they basically said, and by the way, the Uptown had a nurse who was on staff and was there every day. So they said, particularly to moms with kids, they said, get your kid off the filthy air of the Chicago streets, come to the Uptown Theater where we have this incredible air conditioning system. We change the air every few minutes. It is far, far healthier. So during that previous epidemic, rightly or wrongly, indoor entertainment spaces, the very big ones, which were common at the time, they were perceived as safer than the outdoors. So those are just examples, really, of how there were crises that afflicted the theater, but going to the theater was never seen as innately a bad thing to do. So that, I think, explains why so many people in the world of entertainment, that is live entertainment. Obviously, if your business is Netflix or Amazon Prime, then, the pandemic has been very, very good for you. But anybody in the business of live entertainment was utterly unprepared for this level of devastation because, frankly, it really had never happened before. That, yes, there've been other crises, but the theaters were almost always able to reopen and to be able to say, look, reopening is a good thing for America and all of that. So that night, after I got out of 6, I went back to my hotel. It felt, if you were in New York in March, it was a very strange place to be. I'm sure we'll be talking stories about it for years, but I went back to the hotel. I wrote the story about Broadway closing down, and then I flew home, trying to put as much space as possible between me and the guy in the aisle. And then I went to my basement, and here you now find me 11 months later, having only rarely left. So that was that. And then everything started closing in Chicago. Second City, the Goodman, the Lyric Opera, the Art Institute, the Symphony, Steppenwolf, they all roared in like emergency ticker tape on that next morning and on the Friday morning after that. And by the weekend, there were no live arts at all in Chicago to speak of any size. I think by Friday they were all gone. They didn't cancel for very long, if you remember. Many of them said for a few weeks. That was the assumption, and with deep regret. Now, in many cases, they had no choice because the Illinois governor, Governor Pritzker, banned large gatherings. I think initially he banned anything over 250 seats. No, I think actually more than 1,000 seats was the first one, and then it went 250 to 1,000. But by then, it was becoming clear that this was going to present a real problem for the arts and entertainment world. How could theaters pay artists with no income coming from the box office? That was number one. How could they pay their employees? Would patrons accept offers to sort of come back in a year, or even at that moment, actually, it was like come back in a couple of months, or would they demand refunds? And how would these organizations all deal with the problems in cash flow that would create? Would people be willing to give to them to go through this? And then for your friend here, it was like suddenly there were no shows to go to. And as somebody, I've lived in Chicago for 30 years, but my mom is in the UK, and I'd always sort of taken comfort in the existence of O'Hare Airport, and I thought I could always go home if ever there's a problem. I can be there in a second. I've always gone quite a lot. And suddenly travel became very, very, very difficult. And I also began to see that was going to impact the arts and entertainment world too, because on Broadway, but also in Chicago, a good percentage of the audience are tourists for many, many, many shows. And in fact, in Chicago, during my tenure as critic, those shows have been increasing in their ability to draw visitors, and Chicago have been drawing more and more international tourists. And I sort of realized somewhere in March that was not going to come back for a while. And as we sit here right now, we still don't know when it will come back. And the other thing that sort of hit me, and this is kind of more of an existential thing, is that I realized that what I did was dependent on somebody else doing something first. If you think about what a critic does, you review something. And if there was nothing to review, what were you going to write about? And I also found myself realizing that going out at night to a show was a bit of an addiction of mine, and that I'd really come to love the beauty of it, the ugliness of it, the rush of ideas, even the difficult confrontations, and they'd sustained me throughout most of my adult life. I've always felt that this isn't so much a job as a gift, really, that transforms into something different every night. And then I get the chance to tell other people that they should go see it too. So I'd always thought to myself that I had in my head the idea that it, when I finally pack it all in, I wanted to tell the theater artists of the city that everything I've been doing all these years is merely reactive, that actually I have nothing to say unless they do it first. Without the actual show, without the work of art, without the concert, the review has no purpose, really. Without the work of artists, there's nothing to riff on or to be inspired by or to cry over, to marvel at or dream on or laugh at or object to or get angry at or be empowered by or live through, whatever. And certainly no way to be glad to the bottom of your heart that Chicago is where you lived, where you could go to these theaters and see this unique thing that we have here. And so I began to feel, I think, a real sense of loss. And then my job turned into bad news, really. Stories of death, frankly, stories of closure, stories of struggle, all of those things. And to some degree, it's remained so ever since, albeit at different levels of intensity. But then we began to see theaters try to adapt to this new world. And that was a very, very, very interesting thing. They began to understand streaming theater. So the idea of what we're now doing on Zoom, which I'm guessing for everybody listening to me right now, this is not a particularly big deal. That you've probably done this many times over the last few months. You're probably very adept at it. You're probably used to it. You probably maybe even see it as advantageous in that you don't have to schlep out to the library. We've all become very, very accustomed to it. But it's not long ago when most people had never heard of Zoom, never used Zoom, never cared to use Zoom, certainly didn't see it as a substitute for live entertainment. And of course, many people still don't, including your friend here. But nonetheless, that the theaters tried to sort of deal with that. And it was difficult because they weren't movie studios. They were live operations for the most part. But they began to see that they had no other choice, really. I found that my neighborhood changed too, that it felt, walking the dog as I did every night, that everyone was locked away staring at screens. I still feel that when I walk the dog, that everyone is just watching the screen. We're all watching digital facsimiles of each other, and we've become sort of strangely accustomed to it. And it's a very, very strange, experience, I think. I don't mean to say that this is an era when we're suffering more than times of the past, because there were many times in the past when groups of humans arguably suffered more than many of us have. Although what we've suffered in this pandemic, of course, varies, and I'm sure there are people on this call who have suffered mightily and still do. But you know, nonetheless, it is a strange sort of thing. I began to sort of start thinking about what is this era? What is it the end of, or what is it the beginning of? And I began to sort of ask myself this question. It's very, very difficult, I think, to understand what's happening culturally in our world right now, because we're living through this sort of massive amount of change. A conversation that I am constantly, not a day goes by, it seems, is basically some version of the conversation of, to what extent are the changes in our world permanent? So on a very simple level, will the library still have Zoom programming 5 years from now, or will it not? And that's actually a very difficult question to answer or predict. In other words, to what extent have we changed permanently, and to what extent are we in a temporary sort of vibe? I don't know the answer to that. I do know, as the great Tony Kushner said in Angels in America, the world only spins forward, which is to say you can't go backwards. You can never go back to before, as they say in ragtime. I have a quote from every show for every moment. And I think that's true too. But nonetheless, there's a lot of unknowns about all of that. And really, what's been happening for the last few weeks and months is that people in the arts have been asking a whole variety of questions. When will it be safe to reopen? Is it ethical to reopen? That was a good question too. And then, of course, what changes will have taken place when we do reopen? And of course, they had a lack of control, because what they were doing, to a large extent, was also, of course, dictated by government authorities. So as we sit here right now, you cannot, in the city of Chicago, invite more than 50 people into a theater. And that's likely to remain that way for a while, I think. But it was also, aside from that, it was just a very difficult ethical dilemma. It remains so. Nobody wanted to put performers at risk. Nobody wanted to put audience members at risk. On the other hand, there was no revenue, no box office revenue. Therefore, they were all theaters, like restaurants, really, in much the same way, were then saying, well, at least we could keep people employed if we opened. So all of that was very, 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 very different, very difficult, excuse me. And they were also mulling over the same question I brought up a minute ago, which is there going to be a light switch when we all go back? Is someone going to wave an all clear? Is the air raid siren going to, the all clear siren going to blare? No, I don't believe that it is. And so what does that mean? And so a lot of theaters have been sort of exploring what that really means. You can't perform Hamilton in a face mask. You can't. You can maybe sing with a shield on, but it's very difficult. And so I think that, that's a very difficult issue. Can you really socially distance? In a lot of theaters, especially in downtown Chicago or on Broadway, the other thing that I think it's important to understand is that it's almost impossible to operate at less than full capacity. Now, if you'll let me bore you for a minute with sort of economics of show business, let me just say a quick sort of 5 seconds on that. Thanks to sort of what they call variable ticket pricing, which is a bit like the airlines, where they charge different amounts based on demand. So it's more on a Saturday night than a Monday or a Wednesday afternoon, say. Almost every show now is full. So if you go to Broadway, or even in downtown Chicago, most of the time, you're sitting around lots of other people. A hit show charges people more money than a not hit show, or a medium hit show, or even a flop. But still, even the flops mostly are full. And so Broadway producers, the reason Broadway has stayed closed really is that they decided they could not possibly operate at less than 100% capacity. And as we sit here right now, that's still pretty much what I hear. They're quite happy to have people wear masks. They're happy to they've improved their air filtration systems. They'll do temperature checks in the lobby. All of that is easy for them to do. What has stopped them more than anything is what they perceive as their inability to operate at less than 100% capacity. Sports stadiums have managed to do this. I believe there's 22,000 fans going to be there on Sunday for the Super Bowl in Florida, which you could not do here, obviously. But then, of course, they're outside, and those are huge things. If you compare that to a Broadway theater or a Chicago theater, then what you see in those theaters is those are mostly Victorian buildings, and they're listed on historical registers. You can't blow up the lobby. You can't expand the public space. You can't take out seats. They are what they are, and I think that sort of explains to some degree why they've remained closed. The other thing, so that's that. But I still don't know what's changed forever. I mean, one of the interesting things that's happened is many of you, if you're listening to me or you read me regularly, you probably subscribe to an arts organization. That is to say, you pay your money once a year and you buy a season. That's gotten very, very difficult now. Part of my job has always been to announce the seasons of theaters. That is to say, I write a story saying the Marriott Lincolnshire is doing X, 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 and X. Well, those stories I've written about 4 times because they've kept changing. And that, has made it very difficult to plan ahead. So the other thing about the arts that's really difficult in this pandemic has been the inability to plan. So if you take, for example, one of the interesting questions right now for you music lovers is, will there be a summer season at Ravinia? And if you were to ask me that, I would answer, I don't know. I don't think Ravinia knows. They would like there to be. The CSO would definitely like there to be, but nobody knows at this moment. It's just sort of too difficult to say. The problem for Ravinia and many other summer organizations, Grant Park's the same, is that normally they would know their season by now. And to some degree, their season is dependent on people touring. And if enough venues are closed, people are not going to tour. And even if it turns out to be safe by the summer and people are willing to go out, it's very challenging to actually have a full slate of programming. So I think probably what we'll see this summer is more local work and more shows that people have put together with less time. And that might actually be good because it'll be nice to sort of showcase the artists in our own city because, God knows they deserve it. So I think that will actually be that will actually be a really good thing. I think that people are going to want to have a good time at the end of this. I hear all the time from people telling me how they're ready to go out, especially some of my older readers who've maybe even had the vaccine by now, if they're lucky. They're definitely ready. They're definitely ready to go out. And I think we need an antidote, certainly, to some of the things that we've all seen together, like that we thought we'd never see. A roadblock between the states of Louisiana and Texas, for example, which I never thought I would see, or the scenes in New York outside those funeral homes. Um, so I think that's just something that we're all sort of dealing with. Um, Whether or not theaters will need to change permanently, I don't know. I don't think so. But it's possible that dressing rooms may have to be bigger, that people won't want to share dressing rooms, at least for a while. Maybe people will go into a lobby more gradually. Maybe people will exit a theater by row, not all at once. I don't know. I don't know any of those things. I do, though, think that this period will go down in history as a period when we all realize that what we do as individuals, maybe most of us will realize that what we do as individuals actually impacts things on a global scale. And we also know that wealth can get destroyed, or that jobs can be lost, or that vibrant humans can end up uh, in hospital through no fault of their own, and without any war, at least, is visible. Um, and I think that we're also going to now learn that incredibly unpredictable things actually do happen. One of the things that people say so much about this time is that nobody could predict it. And I think that's true. That's true. But we now know that the worst case scenarios can be real in a way that I don't think any of us ever did before, even those of us who've been on the planet for a good long time. And I think perhaps there might be some people, there's some future filmmakers maybe, who will think that this time that we finally realized we'd lost touch with what really matters, that we became overly obsessed with arguing among each other, or maybe just working or partying or complaining in a way that we didn't really plan in the right way for this kind of threat. Um, and I think I think that that's true too. I was always fascinated by our inability to pause, and what I mean by that is that I was like, well, people can stop individually. So I could go away for a year and take a sabbatical, and certainly people have health issues and then they come back, or people arrange their lives, have a child, say. But the crisis sort of proved how hard it is for humanity collectively to do that. Um, if you think about it, had we all locked down perfectly for a small amount of time, could have been no transmission of the virus. But of course, we couldn't, because we have to eat, we have to have medical care. We can't actually stop for a minute. And those of us who are young, I think it's fair to say, find it especially difficult to stop. It's very, 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 very difficult. We've sort of set up a society, in my view, really, that requires constant motion. I don't know if any of you like to take cruises or did like to take cruises, but like airplanes, cruise ships have been set up to cruise continually. And even now, they're not really stopped. They're just idling somewhere in the ocean, waiting for a return. It's very difficult to stop, I think. And I think that is an interesting thought, that maybe we need to rethink that a little bit, that we have a society that just can't even pause for a second. And I think that's sort of interesting. I worry too about our ease with digital facsimiles. I do worry that right now you're looking at digital Chris Jones and you might actually prefer that to the real thing, although he's much more handsome in person. But I would say that it is difficult to it's not been a good time for carbon-based humans, that we're all interacting with digital facsimiles all the time, and we're becoming scarily sort of accepting of that. And probably we remain nervous of very big crowds. So you know, again, that's all dependent on what happens over the next few months, how much of this turns out to be permanent. But I do think we're going to have to learn not to social distance. I find myself walking the dog, even with a mask on. I tend to cross the road if I see somebody coming, if just out of politeness. But it's just, there's a certain sadness to that, and I really feel that. I really feel that. I really feel that very acutely. I also hope that this time will be a sort of a time of renewed compassion for one's fellow traveler, maybe some spiritual renewal, of a reordering of priorities, of the end of so much time wasting perhaps, and maybe a new respect for science and data and competence overall. Maybe we'll see more global cooperation now. Certainly, I think we're seeing um, a new valuing of essential workers, of people who, you know, deliver our food for us. Um, and I think we are all, some of us anyway, have been able to become closer with our families. Um, and that's all true. But on the other hand, I also think that once this is over, we're going to see another version of the Roaring Twenties, as everybody comes out of their homes. We kind of are curled up, you know, like springs, ready to unleash the world. And I think that's sort of true. I've had a couple of hints of that. In the summer, I got over to London in that lull when you could do that. And I went to a show, actually. I went to see Jesus Christ Superstar in Regent's Park. And I sat with a couple of hundred people in a very big theater listening to a concert version of this show, which I'm sure you know. And people around me were crying. They really were in tears, and they were in tears mostly at just being at a show. And if you love musicals, especially, you really, it doesn't do it on the TV, does it? You really want to be there. And I can't tell you how moving that night was. And I will say this, that there's a lot of things that we have taken for granted outdoors, many of them artistic, going to a musical, going to a play, even going out for dinner, that I don't think that we are going to take for granted in quite the same way anymore, because we're sort of aware of what life is like, what life is like without those things. So I do think that all of those things, and I say this to actors when I see them, I always say, what you do now will be more valued. Trust me on that, you'll see. Um, and even a couple of the things that were in parks last summer, I felt the same way. There were people who had journeyed to a park to support some artist, and they were determined to sit there, however cold it was, just as some people have wanted to support their local restaurant, and they've sat under some pathetic heat lamp in 10 degrees just to sort of help that business out. And I do think, I do think that's a kind of wonderful thing. I went outside with the dog. It was the Saturday after the election results, actually. And if you remember that day, it was a strikingly warm and sort of optimistic day. And there were people honking their horns and all of that, if you remember. And it reminded me of the World Series, when the Cubs won the World Series and everyone came out of their houses in the same way. But I did feel that on that day, like a bunch of people were kind of coming out of their basements, and were sort of celebrating the day. It was like, I don't know, people were sort of poking one big toe out and then suddenly feeling, that it was safe to do that. And they were all walking around. And they just reopened outdoor dining, I think, at that moment. And, there was tables of people as well, as the dog and I walked around. And I remember thinking, it's going to be all right. Everything is going to come back, and that everyone's going to want to be together again. And people are not going to live their lives on Zoom anymore. And and I think people were a little exhausted that day, but also just relieved that the sun was shining and that there was change in the air and everything was all right. And maybe I just made this up because I'm a romantic, but I felt like people were smiling at me a little bit more and maybe even waving at me a little bit more, and that everyone was a little more tolerant of each other, even people of different opinions or different political affiliations and all of that. And I actually got in the car with the dog again, my constant companion, and we drove up Sheridan Road up into the suburbs. I live on Chicago. I live in Lakeview in the city, and we drove up Sheridan Road, and everywhere you went, and we drove all the way to Highland Park, and everywhere you went, it was the same. People were out, people were talking. Everyone seemed to be recovering a little bit. And then, of course, it didn't go as simply as that, right? We had this fall, and we still have, even though we're now slowly getting our vaccines, we still have this palpable sense of anxiety about everything. And, it's like I don't have any panacea, and I don't know how much the world is going to be different. I do feel, though, some things really strongly. One is that the arts are going to be a huge part of our recovery, and that we're going to care about them in a way that we hadn't before, because they'll bring us together in a really meaningful way. And that we will, maybe this summer, maybe this fall, but you'll be sitting in a theater, you'll look around and you'll go, life's not so bad. And thank God that's over. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm delighted to take some questions.
Thank you, Chris. Oh gosh, I'm glad how you end on that positive note. I would love to be at Ravinia this summer. That was going to be one of my questions for you. But one of the questions I had for you, Chris, was I know that there's a lot of concern about just all the work, everybody that worked in this industry, and they haven't worked for quite a long time. And I'm wondering whether you feel like there's been a lot of, well, some of these artists have used this time to create some really amazing work, whether we'll see a lot of work following this that was created during this time that'll be just off the charts creative, whether you think, I'm not sure when we're going to be ready to actually see a play about the pandemic. I think that could be many years from now. But just in terms of, do you hear from people that it's been a creative time for them? Do they use this time to just?
I think that's a really great question that's difficult to answer. I think for some people, I do hear that everyone's working on their projects, and that I think, a lot of art is rushed. Frankly, a lot of the shows I've reviewed historically have been under-rehearsed in my mind. But I think that this one, I think there will be extraordinary work. However, having said that, I do think some people have been unable to work. I think it's not been a creatively, not everybody has been able to say, okay, now I can lock myself away and write the great American novel. Some people have really struggled to do anything other than just get by, and there's no shame in that in my mind. But I think that remains to be seen, but I'm hopeful that will be the case.
Let's see, we have some questions here from some people watching. Someone writes, pre-pandemic Broadway tickets were often very costly, more than your everyday consumer might afford. What do you project for ticket prices post-pandemic?
That's a great question. I think they will initially have to come down. I don't think anyone is going to drop $800 for a Broadway seat on a Friday night. I don't. I think they will, and I think they will be under what I would call moral or ethical scrutiny. I think theaters are going to have to give away tickets to healthcare workers. There's going to have to be a thank you period. I don't think these shows are going to be charging the same level. Now, at the end of the day, they're businesses, and if demand picks up, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe quickly we'll go back to that. But I think initially, they will not be. People, are out of the habit of going to the arts in general. And this is the big, $1 million question. Is there, and you'll have to answer this maybe if you have an opinion, tell me in the chat, but is there just going to be massive demand because people are so desperate to get out of their houses? Or are some people out of the habit of it, and maybe still scared to go, and right, understandably so, and therefore the demand will be soft initially. And I don't think people know the answer to that yet. And it will depend, I think, on really the vaccines is what it really depends on, and how successfully that rollout happens and what the impact of that rollout is.
We have a lot of people here in our area who are subscribers to the Marriott Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
There's a question about, do you know any news from them?
Yeah, I talked about them recently. They're planning on coming back. I think they're hoping to be back in the summer. I would say they are among the more optimistic theaters. They did, I don't know if you all know this, but they did do some things on the golf course, right, not far from you, right?
Right, yeah.
I didn't see any of those, but they did that. And outdoors, obviously, outdoors is obviously something they could do. It's just difficult to make any money at that, frankly, because you've got to build the whole thing and blah, blah, blah. But I think they've got plans this summer to do that again. And I think they're hoping to be back late summer or early fall. That's what I heard. They've had a very difficult time. You know, the commercial theaters, that is to say, the for-profit theaters, which Marriott's one, Drury Lane in Oakbrook is one, Second City is one. They have really, in many ways, really struggled. Some of them have been able to get the PPP loans, and there's a thing going on right now called Save Our Stages that's providing money for people, but it's been very challenging for them to. Um, it's just been very challenging for them to survive. Whereas if you look at, say, Riders Theatre, not too far from your library, they've been they have some very generous donors, and some of those donors have stepped up, and that's true of many of the nonprofit theaters, and some of them have done it very quietly. But I think it's worth saying in general that many of people ask me sometimes, are all these theaters going to be able to come back? And I often say, I think most of them will, because many of them have had very generous supporters who have said, and frankly, it's not just people with a ton of money. It's people who've said, I don't need a refund for that ticket right now. Yes, I'll take the exchange. I'll come back in 2022 or whenever you do the show, but you don't have to give me your money back. And that's helped. And so I've heard a lot of reports, honestly, and I'm guessing some of these people are in this call, but I've heard a lot of reports of very generous supporters. And that's been one of the great things about this.
Someone would like to know whether theater companies ever seek your input on productions in progress in order to avoid staging a financial loser.
Well, that does happen quite a lot with what are called out-of-town tryouts. So as many of you probably know, there are Broadway shows. Many of them are produced outside the city first so they can work the kinks out. And I've become kind of the guy that, they come to Chicago and I write a review. And often those shows then use that review when they sort of readapt themselves for Broadway. That happens often. Um, so it does happen. It doesn't really usually happen in advance of a show, because of course I don't see it really until opening night, and by then, if they've got a flop show, they usually have a flop show and there's not much they can do. But if it's a show that's in a sort of a workshop phase, then absolutely they do. Yeah.
Someone here would like to know about, how are you filling your days these days? Like, what is Chris Jones's life like, since you're not going to the theater, 5 nights a week?
It's weird. It's weird. I'm writing a lot of things. If you read the Tribune, you'll know this, but I'm writing about lots of different things. And that's really what I'm doing. I'm still writing columns. And frankly, there's been a lot of news. This is a big story. The arts and COVID is a huge story. So I've not been short of stories to write. I just find them depressing, because so many of them have been about troubles. But and of course, there's been a lot of other, society's gone through other turmoil that the arts are also part of, and a lot of arts organizations are trying their best to be responsive to that, which is a wonderful thing. So there's been no shortage of news. And I've been reviewing some of the online stuff. It's difficult. And just to be brutally honest, it's a tough time to be a critic. I don't really have in general any problem with being critical. I mean, I am after all a critic. And I do believe that if you like everything, nobody believes you when it's really good. But this time, it's been really hard to do that, because everyone is under such duress and struggling in such a way that I haven't felt good about that. So I think I have to get my identity back, but I don't think that's really going to happen until the theaters reopen.
Right. Okay. Someone here wants to know, someone would like to know, what is the worst show you've ever seen? Are you able to comment on that?
There was a horrible, horrible show called Moon Over Miami, which a lot of critics in Chicago remember. It's a long time ago. It would have been the early 90s. It was at a theater called Remains Theater, which was then on Clark Street. Actually, it's now, that theater's been demolished now, and that was truly horrendous. It was a John Guare play called Moon Over Miami. That was pretty terrible. There was a show at the Royal George about a bunch of auto mechanics and their girlfriends, the name of which I've repressed. That was also pretty terrible. And there's been a few on Broadway that have been pretty bad too. There's a review about the Shirelles that was terrible. There's, I've seen some dogs in my time, I can tell you.
Okay. Well, I think we got through the questions that people submitted. And because I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And I really have been following you this whole time. I always do, but I've been following this topic and reading your columns the last 11 months to see, hoping for like some positive news, some glimmer of hope. And I can't wait until we start reading your columns and you have really positive news to share with us and you start revealing, announcements about things that we can
Yeah,
also enjoy.
I can't wait for that. And I do feel that we've turned a corner. I may be premature, but I feel that we have the last few weeks. I feel like the worst is behind us. We've just got to get through this winter, and then I think life will be a lot better for everybody.
Yeah, the news of the vaccine is hopefully it's going to accelerate, and then we'll just really change.
It's huge. That's really always, for the arts, that's always been the only end game, to be honest. The only way to get people back is for people to have had the vaccine. There's no other way, ultimately. Everything else, there was no solution. This is the only solution. So
I did read an article, I can't recall where it was, but about some theater that was potentially going to be like testing patrons as they were coming into the theater, but are those rapid tests reliable enough? Not really. And so it wasn't really going to be an option.
Well, and it's also, I was talking to a theater owner. He said, "Well, then what happens? You kick the person. What do you do if somebody tests positive? Do you not let them in? What do you give them a refund? Are you going to get them out of the lobby? What are you going to do with the rest of their party? Are you going to not let any? I mean, it was a nightmare. Nobody in the world of entertainment wanted that atmosphere at their theater. Nobody wanted a lobby with, all these tests and what to do if somebody tests positive. And I think the hope has always been there'll be a vaccinated audience, and the vaccinated audience will be ready to come back to the arts. And I think, we have a good chance of getting there. It's just frustrating how long it's taking, but it's, it is what it is. And with it, we just have to keep our eye on the end of it.
Right. So anyhow, I just want to make sure another announcement. Everybody knows that we do record the sessions and people that are messaging about this. Yes, it is recorded. We'll make sure you get it in your inbox the next day or so. And again, thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I know you're all eager to hear from Chris and probably are eager to get back in the theaters and just see a nice show, hear a great concert. So thank you for joining us tonight. Chris, thank you again for your time. And
it's a pleasure. Can I just say, I hope the next time it's in person, everybody, and we'll see each other again.
I hope so too. Have a nice evening, everybody.
Bye, everybody.